It was a muggy July night in 2013 in Fairmount, one of those small towns in rural Ohio, where everyone knows everyone and almost nothing happens, the kind of place where the days repeat themselves like a grandfather clock, and any unusual noise is enough to make the curtains move discreetly behind the windows. That night, the air was heavy, humid, the kind of heat that seems to stick to the skin and make the room slower, quieter. The cicadas sang loudly outside, and the distant sound of a train cut through the air every now and then. Inside 42 Maple Street, Hannah Miller was alone. She was a 17-year-old girl, a dedicated, reserved student, the kind who speaks softly and listens more than she says. Her mother, a nurse on duty, had left for the hospital around 10, as she did every night, leaving her daughter with a kiss on the forehead and the promise to bring pancakes for breakfast. But when the kitchen clock struck 11:45, something began to change. A metallic clang echoed outside, a quick, almost imperceptible sound, but enough to make the neighbor's puppy bark non-stop. The next few minutes were lost in silence. No one saw what happened inside the house. There were no screams, no broken glass, no sign of a struggle. When the sun rose, Hannah's room was intact except for one detail. The window, which always remained locked, was ajar. The warm breeze made the curtains sway slightly, and the girl's favorite blanket lay on the floor as if it had been hurriedly ripped off. Her cell phone remained on the desk, her backpack in the corner, and her diary open to the last page written the night before, with a loose sentence, "I think I'm being watched." The mother arrived home shortly after 7 in the morning, and at first felt nothing different. She called her daughter, made coffee, turned on the radio, but the silence persisted. When she went upstairs and entered the bedroom, her heart seemed to stop for a moment. The pillow still bore the imprint of Hannah's head, and the room exuded that sweet scent of young perfume mixed with fear. Linda screamed her daughter's name, ran into the backyard, and looked at the deserted street. Nothing. No neighbors had seen any movement, no suspicious cars, no noise other than the early morning crickets. And so, almost invisibly, began the disappearance that would forever mark the life of a mother, a neighborhood, and an entire town. The kind of story that, at first, seems like just another passing scar, but which little by little begins to transform into something much darker, and which in Fairmount would leave a scar that time would never erase. Stories like Hannah's resonate with us because they touch on that fear everyone has but rarely talks about, the fear of what might happen in their own neighborhood behind a half-open window when no one is looking. And that's why you're here, because you feel the truth behind every disappearance, every detail that seems small but hides something enormous. This is the place for those who aren't content with shallow versions, for those who want to understand what really happened, for those who want to see the story told with the weight, drama, and truth it deserves. Be a part of that. Come to this community of those who live and breathe mystery, twists and turns, and real emotion. Press the subscribe now, let the like, and helps keep alive this chain of stories that cannot, and should not, be forgotten. Hannah Miller was always the kind of girl who went unnoticed, but left a silent impression on those who knew her. She wasn't popular, she wasn't the center of attention at school, but there was something about her that caught your attention. Perhaps it was the way she observed the world, always with that curious, almost suspicious look, as if she saw what others preferred to ignore. She grew up in Fairmount, a town too small for the dreams she held within herself. From an early age, she learned to cope with the absence of her father, a police officer who died in a car accident when she was just 8. Her mother, Linda, took on everything alone, the grief, the bills, raising her daughter, and the exhausting hospital routine. She was a strong woman, the kind who doesn't have time to complain but who, deep down, carries a weariness that her smile tries to hide. And Hannah, young as she was, sensed this. Perhaps that's why she was so mature, so concerned with not causing trouble, so willing to help. She studied. Drew did volunteer work on the weekends and took care of the garden of Mrs. Rose, the neighbor next door, who was always complaining about the rose bushes. The life of the two, mother and daughter, was simple, marked by small rituals. Friday nights were reserved for old movies, Sunday mornings for pancakes and stories from the past that Linda recounted fondly. It was a relationship of complicity, of comfortable silences, but in the last few months, something had changed. Hannah had become distracted, looking out the window more often, sleeping poorly. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night and send random messages to her mother just to check if she was still in the hospital. "Is everything okay there?" she would ask. Linda would respond with heart emojis, unaware of the growing fear gripping her daughter. What no one knew was that for weeks, Hannah had been feeling like she was being watched. At first, she thought it was paranoia. Then she began noticing small signs, a shadow that seemed to move in front of the house, the subtle sound of footsteps in the backyard, the creaking of a gate when there was no wind. She even mentioned it to her mother, but Linda, tired and rational, believed it was just anxiety. "It's all in your head, love, it's safe here," he said, but Fairmount had a curious way of hiding secrets. Behind the well-painted fences and the smiles at the cafes, there were stories no one told. Thomas Reed, for example, was one of those walking secrets. He lived 2 houses down from the Millers, always polite, always willing to help. He helped with the trash, mowed lawns for elderly neighbors, offered rides. Everyone saw him as a kind, hard-working man, someone whom life had dealt badly but who had moved on with dignity. No one knew much about his past, only that he had lived in other towns and preferred to be alone. Hannah saw him often, especially when she went out to walk Mrs. Rose's dog. He would greet her with that shy, emotionless smile, and somehow it always made Hannah uncomfortable. She couldn't explain why, but something about him made her want to cross the street. Over time, this discomfort became a constant presence. Sometimes she felt his gaze as she hung clothes on the line. Other times she saw his silhouette standing at the gate, watching silently. She even mentioned it to Mrs. Rose, but the neighbor laughed. "Oh, Thomas is harmless, dear. He's just lonely." Lonely. That word echoed in Hannah's head for days, until one June afternoon, something happened she couldn't ignore. She was walking home from school alone, walking down her usual street, when she noticed a car driving too slowly behind her. It wasn't a strange car, it was Thomas's. He drove calmly, looking straight ahead, as if simply following his path. But Hannah felt a chill. She quickened her pace, turned the corner, went inside, and locked all the doors. That night she drew something unusual in her notebook. Usually it was flowers, landscapes, anonymous faces. But this time she drew a shed, a dark space with a locked door and a boarded-up window. And in the corner of the page, she wrote, "It looks like a place I've seen before." She didn't remember being there, but the drawing had come almost automatically, as if from a distant memory. The next day, she left the notebook open on the table, and when her mother saw it, she just smiled. "You should study architecture, Hannah. You have a talent for imagining things." Hannah didn't answer. She just looked out the window. The following weeks were marked by a strange atmosphere. Summer arrived in full force, the heat increased, and the city seemed more alive. But inside the Miller house, something grew heavier and heavier. Hannah began locking her bedroom window even during the day. He began sleeping with a pair of scissors under his pillow, and every time the phone rang and no one answered on the other end, she trembled. Still, she tried to act normal. I went to school, met friends, smiled in photos, but there was a tension in her gestures, a look that always seemed to be searching for something or someone. It was during this time that Linda began to notice the changes in her daughter. The lost looks, the silence during dinner, the questions about security, locks, cameras. "Is everything okay, daughter?" she'd ask, and Hannah always gave the same fragile smile. "Yes, you are, Mom." But she wasn't. And deep down, Linda knew it. The problem was that she herself was too exhausted to face what she was feeling. The shifts at the hospital, the overdue electricity bill, her body crying out for rest, all of this made her believe her daughter's worry was just a reflection of her own anxiety. So that Friday in July, when she left for another night shift, Linda never imagined it would be the last time she'd see Hannah before everything changed. The clock struck 10 o'clock when she grabbed her car keys. Hannah was on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "Lock everything, okay?" her mother said. "And don't sleep late." The girl nodded, but her gaze didn't match her calm tone. Linda watched her for a moment before leaving, with that strange feeling every mother knows, the premonition that something isn't right. On the way to the hospital, she almost went home, almost made up an excuse to miss work. But she kept driving. It was just another shift, she thought, just one more night. But on that sultry night, somewhere between the sound of the cicadas and the creaking of the gate, something happened inside that house, something that would change everything. And later, when the authorities searched every corner, every detail, They would realize the signs were there all along, in the deleted messages, in the open diary, in the silent fear of a girl who felt she was being watched, but no one believed her. The morning after the disappearance, the Miller house looked different. There were no screams, no movement, just the distant sound of a radio playing an old song while the kettle hissed on the stove. Linda, still drowsy, called out for her daughter twice before heading upstairs. The silence that followed was so strange she laughed nervously. Perhaps Hannah had overslept. She opened the bedroom door and the world seemed to stop. The bed was unmade, the blanket on the floor, the window open, letting in a warm, heavy breeze. Her school bag leaned against the wall, her cell phone on the desk, and her diary lay open with a blank page, as if something had been snatched from it in a hurry. No note, no noise, nothing to indicate where she had gone. For the first few minutes, Linda tried to rationalize. Maybe her daughter had gone to the neighbor's house. Maybe I had gone for an early walk. But the clock was already showing 8:30, and Hannah never left without warning. That was when her worry began to turn to dread. News of her disappearance spread quickly, as it often does in small towns. Within hours, neighbors were knocking on doors offering help. Some claimed to have seen a figure walking down the road. Others swore they had heard the sound of a car in the early hours of the morning, but nothing concrete. The police arrived around noon, 2 young, tired officers with the bureaucratic look of someone who had seen dozens of teenage runaways before. They asked quick questions, jotted down times, took a few photos, and finally said what every mother dreads hearing. There doesn't seem to be any sign of foul play. She probably left on her own. Linda was in shock. How could a girl who left her cell phone, her money, and even her favorite shoes simply walk away? But no one seemed to listen. As the police officers retreated, a neighbor appeared, offering help. Thomas Reed, the man from the house 3 doors down, the same one who always seemed to be nearby. He wore a worried expression, holding a cup of coffee and shaking his head ruefully. "This is terrible, Linda. If you need anything at all, let me know." In that moment, she felt grateful. Thomas had always been kind, always willing to help, and in the midst of desperation, any gesture of empathy felt like a lifeline. He offered to organize a search party, saying he knew some hikers in the area, and that his old shed could be used as a base. "It's spacious. You can leave supplies, maps, anything the police need." Linda agreed without a second thought. And so, the first day of the search began. But as everyone mobilized, one detail went unnoticed. Thomas seemed to know too much. Even before anyone mentioned Hannah's usual haunts, he was already suggesting routes, pointing out directions, and commenting on the most likely possibilities. When he spoke, he always used the term she in the past tense, which sent a strange shiver down the spine of anyone paying attention. Yet no one suspected. In a town like Fairmount, where everyone knows everyone else, evil never seems to have a face. And perhaps that was precisely what made it so dangerous. As hours turned into days, hope began to mix with despair. Posters were posted, searches organized, and with each new shift of volunteers, Thomas was there, helping, guiding, comforting. And that's when a pattern began to emerge, but so subtly that almost no one noticed. He always found a way to be present, always the center of attention, always the first to arrive, and the last to leave. When Linda cried, he was the one who offered her tissues. When the police questioned schedules, he was the one who remembered details. He seemed so involved that it was impossible to imagine someone with such zeal could hide anything. But there was something strange about his presence, the way he observed Hannah's room during the searches, the way he ran his fingers over her desk, or the way he stared out the open window, not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet nostalgia. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, a faint smile would appear on his face. A quick, almost imperceptible gesture that left those who saw it with a feeling difficult to explain. Still, the case remained unsolved. Linda, increasingly exhausted, began to feel like the whole world was against her. Investigators disappeared, the media lost interest, and the neighbors returned to their routine. Only Thomas remained constant, showing up every afternoon to ask if there was any news, always willing to lend a hand, a shoulder to cry on, a ride, a conversation. And it was precisely this consistency that kept him above suspicion. While Hannah's mother was racked with despair, searching for answers, he maintained absolute control, fueling the hope of others while carefully covering his tracks. And there, Amidst the forced normalcy of Fairmount, an invisible pattern began to emerge, a sequence of small details that would only make sense much later. A forgotten shed at the back of a lot, a key whose origins were unknown, a light that turned on in the middle of the night and went out before dawn. These were clues that were right there in front of everyone's eyes, but no one could connect them. Not yet. Because, deep down, no one imagined that the very man organizing the search might be the same man who had locked Hannah away where no one would ever think to look. Linda's trust in the police began to slowly unravel, like a thread snapping without warning. At first, she believed the authorities' strength was the missing hope, that trained and experienced men would be able to find her daughter, to bring Hannah home. But it took only a few days for her to realize the reality was quite different. The first investigation report was empty. Few notes, inconsistent information, no concrete lines. The questions the officers asked seemed more like protocol than a genuine search for the truth. Did Hannah have problems with her mother? Has anyone fought with her recently? Did you have a boyfriend? It was always the same lazy assumptions, as if a teenager's disappearance was simply the predictable result of an impulsive runaway. Linda tried to explain, tears in her eyes, that her daughter would never do something like that, but the officer's cold gaze said it all. They didn't believe her. With each passing day, the police presence diminished. The cars that once filled the street disappeared, visits became sporadic, and the case was pushed into the dark corner of the forgotten files. No evidence of foul play, they repeated like a mantra. It hurt more than anything. Linda felt her voice fading amidst the indifference, and the silence of the house now seemed to echo from within her. She tried to insist, call, text, but received short, bureaucratic, emotionless responses. It seemed everyone had given up except her, and curiously except Thomas Reed, the helpful neighbor, always with that polite smile and serene gaze. He began to show up more often, bringing coffee, asking if she needed anything, offering to help. Keep the search going. In everyone's eyes, he was the epitome of a good citizen, the kind of man anyone would trust. But deep down, something about that exaggerated kindness was starting to bother Linda. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. The way he always knew when she was home alone, the way he offered to take care of things in the shed, his insistence on reminding her that God had a purpose for everything. Yet, in the midst of her despair, she saw him as one of the few people who truly cared. And perhaps that was the cruelest thing of all. While the police treated the case as a teenage runaway, Thomas became the constant thread in the story. He attended meetings, suggested search routes, and pointed out places where Hannah might be. He was the one who motivated the volunteers when their spirits began to flag. "Hope dies last," he would say, with a fatherly tone and a voice that inspired confidence. No one imagined that every word, every gesture was calculated. When the search approached more isolated areas, he was the one who suggested stopping. When someone mentioned searching around the warehouse, Thomas was quick to change the subject, saying that place was dangerous, full of nails and iron. Linda began to feel growing frustration with the authorities' neglect. With each new contact, the response was the same. "We're doing our best." But they weren't. The police chief seemed more interested in closing the case than solving it. The searches slowed down. The volunteers returned to their routines, and little by little Hannah's story faded from the local news. The town, once mobilized, now went on as if nothing had happened. People avoided looking Linda in the eye when they passed her at the grocery store, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear of getting too involved. One Saturday afternoon, after 2 weeks without news, Linda went to the police station for the third time that month. The officer on duty seemed uncomfortable with her presence. "You need to understand that this is a teenager we're dealing with, not a confirmed crime." Linda felt her blood boil. "My daughter didn't run away. She wouldn't leave her cell phone, her money, or her dog." The man just sighed, muttered something about desperate mothers, and turned away. It was there, in that cold hallway, that she realized she was completely alone. Thomas showed up that same night. He brought flowers. He said he didn't want to disturb her, but thought she needed company. He talked about faith, about accepting that perhaps Hannah had chosen to leave. Linda stared at him, trying to understand why his words bothered her so. He spoke calmly, but there was a strange rigidity in his posture, an almost mechanical control. When she cried, he simply watched her unresponsive. No gestures, no hugs, just a steady gaze and a subtle movement of his head, as if he were evaluating something. Over the next few days, Linda began to notice small details. Thomas's shed, which had previously seemed abandoned, now had a light on at night. She even saw a shadow moving behind the dusty window, but when she mentioned it, he laughed. Must have been a mouse or a stray cat. That place is full of holes. Still, the image stuck in her head. That glowing light, that fleeting shadow, and the same rusty smell she'd smelled earlier when she'd been there with the volunteers. Determined not to give up, Linda tried to resume the search on her own. She distributed flyers, traveled to neighboring towns, talked to truck drivers and merchants, anyone who might have seen Hannah, but time began to become an enemy. Each new day without answers seemed to fade the memory of her daughter a little further in the eyes of others. Maybe she's okay somewhere else, they would say, trying to comfort, but their tone sounded more like a warning to give up. And amidst this collective abandonment, Thomas remained, the only one who didn't leave. He offered to help carry boxes, urged her to rest, and spoke as if he knew she would never find what she was looking for. One morning, Linda decided to return to the warehouse. She wanted to check on the boxes of supplies left by the volunteers. The gate was unlocked, which surprised her. She entered slowly, smelling musty and iron. Dust covered everything, but there was something different in the air, a sense that the space had been recently disturbed. As she approached the corner where the tools were kept, she noticed marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. She bent down, ran her hand over it, and noticed the clear shape of chains. Before she could comprehend, she heard the sound of footsteps. Slowly, she turned. Thomas was standing in the doorway, smiling. "Oh, I'm glad you came. This place is dangerous. You shouldn't go in alone." His voice was calm, but there was something different in his eyes, a cool, almost satisfied gleam. She tried to hide her discomfort, made up some excuse, and left as quickly as she could. On the way home, his words echoed in her head. "You shouldn't go in alone." Alone. It was always that word, and in that moment, Linda realized she was truly alone. The police had given up, the neighbors had gone silent, and the only person who still showed up was perhaps the very person she should fear most. That night, as the wind rattled the windows and the clock struck 2 in the morning, Linda opened Hannah's diary once more. She leafed through it slowly, looking at each page, each sentence, until she stopped at a note made just a few weeks before her disappearance. "He's always around." Nothing more, just that. 3 words. And suddenly, everything seemed to fall into place. Thomas's gaze, the smell of rust, the light on in the shed. She felt her heart race, her entire body tingle, but before she could piece it all together, a soft knock echoed on the front door. 3 slow, almost polite knocks, and on the other side, a calm voice called her name. That night, Linda Miller made the decision that would completely change the course of her life. After weeks of being ignored by the police and disbelieved even by her neighbors, she realized that if she wanted answers, she would have to find them herself. There were no more reports, no official searches, no volunteers walking the woods with flashlights. Only the echo of her own despair remained. She spent hours sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her daughter's diary and the clothes still hanging in the closet, as if each piece told a piece of the story no one wanted to hear. Memories came in waves. Hannah's laughter, the sound of her voice asking to sleep with the light on, her last "see you tomorrow" before disappearing. And suddenly, something inside Linda ignited, a kind of strength that arises when fear and pain no longer fit within the body. It was almost midnight when she grabbed her car keys and decided to follow her instincts. The first step was to return to the places her daughter frequented, the school, the park, the corner diner. At each location, a mixture of hope and despair. She asked questions, showed photos, and always heard the same answers. "Sorry, I've never seen it. Does it look like that girl on TV? I hope she's okay." The words were kind, but they sounded hollow. Still, she didn't stop. She ducked into alleys, walked alone through deserted streets, observing every detail with eagle eyes. The city that had once seemed peaceful now gave her chills. Everything seemed different. The shadows seemed longer, the whispers louder, the wind heavier. Over the next few days, Linda began gathering everything she had: notes, schedules, printed maps, anything that might point the way. She spread it all out on the kitchen table, as if piecing together an invisible puzzle, and it was there, staring at the papers, that she noticed something strange. In every search, Thomas was present. In every account, he was the first to arrive, the last to leave, always. Ready to help, always with an explanation at the tip of his tongue. And there was more. The shed. That place he had controlled from the beginning. It was where they kept the flashlights, the supplies, the clothes used in the searches. An old, forgotten shed where no one seemed to want to enter anymore. At first, Linda tried to push the thought away. It was absurd to imagine such a thing. Thomas was kind, respectful, a man everyone trusted, but the coincidences began to pile up, and fear gave way to doubt. She began to observe her neighbor more closely. She noticed he always showed up when she was alone, sometimes just to see how she was feeling, other times to check in on her. And on one of these visits, she noticed something disturbing. On the sole of his shoe there was a trace of dried mud, the same red mud that accumulated near the shed after rain. That night, Linda didn't sleep. She lay awake, sitting in the dark of the living room, trying to piece it all together. The police had given up. Her friends were gone. The case went cold. What if Hannah was alive? What if the man pretending to help her was the same one who had prevented her from returning home? Her questions began to turn into certainty, and her certainty into courage. She knew she couldn't count on anyone, so she planned what she would do. The next day, she would go to the warehouse again, but this time differently. She would go alone, without telling anyone. She wanted to look at every corner, every box, every detail that might have been overlooked. Dawn arrived slowly, with the sky overcast and a cold wind cutting through the air. Linda waited until the street was empty, then walked through the gate and onto Thomas's property. Her heart was pounding so loud she could hear it. Her hands shook as she pushed open the rusty metal door. The noise echoed like thunder. Inside, the air was heavy, smelling of mildew and rust. She passed her flashlight over the dust-covered floor and saw fresh footprints. She walked slowly, each step measured, trying not to make a sound. The walls were covered with old shelves, old tools, and scraps of wood, but what caught her attention was one wall unlike the others. It looked new, freshly painted, as if recently renovated. She approached and touched the surface. She felt the difference in texture, the hollow sound behind it. Her heart raced. She took a step back, looked around, searching for something to hit with. She picked up an iron bar and pressed it against the wall. The sound was clear, dry. Behind that panel there was empty space. For a moment Linda felt her entire body freeze. Before she could do anything, she heard footsteps outside. Slow, steady, approaching. She turned, her blood running cold. The warehouse door opened, and there he was in the doorway, Thomas Reed, with the same calm smile as always. "Linda," he said, his voice light, almost confused. "Are you okay? I thought this place was locked." She tried to hide her alarm, pretending she'd heard a noise and decided to check. He stepped closer, surveying the room, his eyes flicking quickly over the iron bar in her hands and the wall that now betrayed her suspicion. "It's dangerous to mess around in here, you know," he said with the same gentle tone, but with something different in his gaze, something cold, almost calculated. Linda tried to remain calm, responded with a shaky smile, and put the bar aside. "You're right. I was just curious." He watched her for a few long seconds, then let out a soft laugh. Curiosity can lead to dangerous places. She left as fast as she could without looking back. On the way back home, her heart pounded. There was no doubt. There was something in that shed, something he didn't want her to discover. When she got home, she locked all the doors and sat on the floor, gasping for air. Her mind was spinning, her fear was growing, but now there was a certainty pulsing through her. Hannah hadn't run away, and whatever had happened to his daughter, Thomas knew, perhaps too much. Linda spent the rest of the night awake, trying to decide what to do. She considered calling the police, but who would believe her? They'd called her hysterical before. She considered confronting Thomas, but knew it would be dangerous, so she grabbed a notebook and began writing down everything. Dates, times, behaviors, even the smell she'd smelled in the shed. She wanted to record everything, in case something happened to her. And as she wrote, the memory of his words echoed in her mind like a veiled threat. Curiosity can lead to dangerous places. The clock was almost 3 in the morning when a soft sound broke the silence. It was the creaking of a gate. Linda looked out the window and saw a light going out in Thomas's shed. Her heart raced. She felt something was happening right now, something she had to figure out somehow. But before she could act, something even worse occurred to her. What if Hannah was still inside, alive, waiting for someone to finally believe what she'd been warning them all along? The days began to blur together, and Linda no longer knew when she had last slept. With each dawn, hope mixed with fear, and fear turned to anger. She was certain something was wrong, but no one listened. Her tired face, the deep circles under her eyes, and the lost gaze betrayed the exhaustion of a mother fighting against the impossible and against time. People began to avoid her on the street, pitying glances, replaced words, and the house where laughter had once been was now a tomb of memories. The police had abandoned the case, and the reports were now stored in some metal drawer, covered in dust. But Linda didn't stop. She spent her nights reviewing her notes, retracing routes, cross-checking schedules, trying to find a logic, a clue, anything that would lead her to Hannah. Her body couldn't take it anymore. She forgot to eat. Cold coffee piled up on the table, and her head throbbed as if begging for a break that would never come. Sometimes she would stand still, staring at her daughter's open bedroom window, as if expecting her to come back in, laughing, ordering pancakes, pretending none of it had happened. But all that came was silence, the same silence that had accompanied her since that night. Loneliness began to become a constant, suffocating presence, and it was in this abyss that Linda began to talk to herself, in a low voice, as if trying to convince herself there was still hope. "She's alive, I know she's alive." She repeated this so many times that she began to believe it, even when everything around her screamed otherwise. Thomas, on the other hand, was always there, always kind, always helpful, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. He brought groceries, asked how she was, offered to help fix things around the house. Sometimes Linda felt like sending him away, but something in her hesitated. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of confusion. He seemed so normal, so ordinary. That doubting him seemed absurd, and yet the discomfort grew. One afternoon, as he talked about how pain needs time to heal, Linda noticed him watching Hannah's room through the reflection in the window. His gaze was distant, focused, as if reliving a memory. She noticed but pretended not to see. The nights grew too long. The sound of branches tapping against the window made her heart race. Any sound, any shadow, sent Linda running to check the doors. Her fear wasn't just of Hannah's absence anymore. It was of what was around her, of what might be happening right next to her unnoticed. She began locking herself indoors, sleeping on the living room couch, always with the lights on. The phone rang, and she no longer answered. Messages from old friends went unanswered. All that mattered now was finding out the truth. But along with the fear came the weight of guilt. Linda relived every decision, every word, every moment before her disappearance. She remembered the times Hannah had said she was being watched, and how exhausted she'd simply replied, "It's all in your head." That memory hurt more than any wound. She wondered what would have happened if she'd listened, if she'd believed. Sometimes she'd look in the mirror and barely recognize herself. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, her eyes sunken. She was no longer a mother. She was a portrait of pain. Even so, something inside her wouldn't let her give up. It was as if a voice insisted, "Search again." And so she did. She returned to the places her daughter frequented, rummaging through dumpsters, vacant lots, and abandoned houses. One night, she decided to walk to the warehouse. She didn't go inside, but watched from a distance. The place was dark and silent, but something was different. The gate, always closed, was ajar. She took a step forward, but stopped. Fear paralyzed her. She stood there for minutes, watching, until she saw a light flicker on inside and then go out. A shiver ran through her body. She ran back home without looking back. Over the next few days, she began writing everything down in a notebook. Times she'd seen Thomas leave the house, lights on in the shed, strange sounds in the wee hours. It was the only way to stay sane, to keep from going completely insane. Each entry felt like a small victory, a way of telling herself she still had control over something, but deep down, she knew she was on the verge of collapse. Her body begged for rest, but her mind wouldn't let her. The fear of stopping was greater than the fear of continuing. On a cold September morning, Linda received a visit from the local pastor. He tried to comfort her, telling her that perhaps it was time to accept it. "There are pains that have no answers," he said softly. She simply smiled wearily. The kind of smile that comes when someone has cried their eyes out. After he left, she stood in the doorway, looking out at the empty street. Fairmount went about its business as usual, as if nothing had happened. The children went to school, the neighbors watered their gardens, and the world spun on, indifferent to the tragedy that had engulfed the Miller home. That same night, something inside her snapped. Sitting in the living room, her hands trembling over her notebook, Linda glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. The wind blew hard outside, and the front gate began to creak. Suddenly, a sound from the direction of the shed cut through the silence, a metallic, repetitive noise, like the dragging of chains. She stood still, trying to figure out if it was real or if her tired mind was playing tricks. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then came again, louder. Linda's heart raced. She went to the window, opened the curtains a crack, and looked out. The shed was completely dark, but a dim light flickered inside Thomas's house. Fear turned into a silent certainty. Something was happening, and even exhausted, her body screaming for a stop, she knew she couldn't ignore it. She grabbed her coat, flashlight and notebook. She walked to the door with trembling hands. Each step echoed like a drum inside her head. Her heart beat fast, her breath shallow. She stopped on the porch, stared into the darkness, and thought of Hannah. "If this is all I have left to do, I'll go all the way," she whispered to herself. The night was cold, and the air carried that same metallic smell as before, the same one I'd smelled in the shed weeks ago. And as the wind stirred the leaves on the ground, Linda took her first step toward the place she'd so dreaded. She didn't know what she'd find inside, but deep down she sensed the answer was much closer than she'd imagined, and that perhaps, when she found it, nothing would ever be the same again. Thomas Reed was the kind of man the whole town knew, or thought they knew. At 48, he was the picture of normalcy. He worked as a mechanic in a garage near the highway, attended church on Sundays, and often chatted with neighbors about the weather and weekend games. No one ever suspected him. He was the man who mowed Mrs. Rose's lawn when she was sick, who helped fix the neighborhood kids' bikes, who showed up at community parties with that polite, discreet smile. But behind that calm face, there was something no one saw, or perhaps no one wanted to see, an emptiness, a silence that wasn't one of peace, but of control. Thomas had always been methodical. From a young age, he had an obsession with routine, with order. Coffee at 6, work at 8, dinner at 7. Everything was timed, everything in its place. His neighbors called him a proper man, but for him, it was more than a habit. It was a way of keeping what was inside him under control. Because in the hours when silence took over, something dark gained strength. An impulse he tried to hide, but which over time became impossible to contain. The first time this happened, he was 22. He was working as a maintenance assistant in a neighboring town when a young woman disappeared. The case was never solved. Soon after, Thomas moved, and so for years he continued to move, from town to town, from job to job, from history to history. In Fairmount, he found the perfect setting. A small, quiet town, without much police activity. A place where he could start over, be the good neighbor, the trustworthy man. And that's how he met Hannah Miller. The girl walked past his house every day to school, always distracted, with headphones on and her hair tied up messily. Thomas began observing from afar. At first with curiosity, then with growing fixation. I liked her innocence, her calm, her predictable routine. I knew her schedules, her routes, her habits. At first I just observed, but as the weeks passed, the control he feigned began to crack. Each night I felt the urge grow, that old instinct of possession, dominance, power, and like the other times, I knew that sooner or later I would act again. What no one knew was that Thomas had been preparing. Everything for months. The shed at the back of the property wasn't just storage. It was where he spent hours alone, adjusting tools, tinkering with structures, repairing locks. To anyone, he was just a man renovating his space. But behind the old walls lay a reinforced door, a double lock, chains attached to the concrete floor. A place made for silence. a captivity hidden in plain sight. At night, when the city slept, he tested the locks, measured the sound of the chains, adjusted the position of the makeshift iron bed. Every detail was planned, every noise calculated, so that no one would ever suspect. And when the moment came, he acted as if carrying out a task rehearsed 1,000 times. On that sultry July night, he waited until the lights in the Miller house went out. He knew Linda would leave for the hospital around 10, as always. He waited half an hour, crossed the yard with light steps, and reached the window Hannah always left ajar. He'd observed this many times before. A silent push was all it took, and he was inside. The rest for him happened as calmly as changing an engine part. A rag, a firm hand, the girl's slight body being dragged into the yard and placed inside the truck. No one heard a thing, and in less than 15 minutes, Thomas Reed had become the central figure in one of the most disturbing disappearances in Fairmount history. The next day, as the city woke to the news, he maintained his routine. He greeted his neighbors, went to work, had coffee at the bakery. He watched the first news reports and even helped with the search. He seemed sincere, and in a way he was. For Thomas, participating in the hunt for his own victim was part of the pleasure. He enjoyed the feeling of control, the power to deceive everyone. Seeing Linda begging for help without imagining that the man who lent her his shoulder was the same one who had destroyed her life. At night, he would return to the shed, open the hidden door, and observe Hannah, now locked. Silent, her eyes full of fear. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was always calm, almost sweet. "No one will find you here," he would say. "Outside they'll think you ran away, and they'll believe me." As the days passed, Thomas developed a new routine. Work during the day, visits to Linda's house in the late afternoon, and returning to the warehouse when the neighborhood was asleep. The town saw him as an unsung hero, a good man who wouldn't give up the search. The police chief even praised him publicly. "We need more citizens like Mr. Reed." He thanked them with a small smile, while inwardly laughing at the irony. Each word of reassurance was a reminder that the world was blind, and he, invisible. But, like any predator, Thomas began to underestimate the danger. Linda, little by little, began to see what others didn't. He began to notice the contradictions, the coincidences, the glances that lingered a second too long. And what he didn't imagine was that, beneath that fragile exterior of a woman in collapse, a force was born he wasn't prepared to face. Thomas believed he had everything under control, the lies, the captivity, the neighbor's trust. But the truth has a strange way of emerging, even when evil does everything it can to bury it. And in Fairmount, evil was much closer to being revealed than he could ever imagine. The cruelest blow of the whole story came when Linda thought she finally had a clue. It was a cold morning, almost a month after the disappearance, when she found an envelope in the mailbox. There was no return address, just her name handwritten in shaky, spaced letters. Her heart raced. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely open the paper. Inside was a short note, written in Hannah's handwriting. "Mom, I'm gone. Don't look for me. I need some time. I'm fine." Linda read and reread those words dozens of times. Relief and despair mingled in a single scream that wouldn't come out. She cried, laughed, fell to her knees on the porch, feeling the weight of longing and the doubt that she could finally breathe. For a moment she believed. She wanted to believe, but something inside her told her something was wrong. The handwriting was the same, but not quite the same. The letters looked forced, as if someone had tried to imitate the stroke, unaware of Hannah's lightness of writing. And yet, hope was too strong a trap. Linda took the note to the police station, but the police chief only glanced at it and shrugged. "See? She wanted to leave. She's alive. This case is closed, Mrs. Miller." It was at that moment that Linda realized the system had officially given up on her daughter. No one would look for Hannah anymore. No one but her. But what Linda didn't know, what no one knew, was that the note was the final piece of Thomas's plan. He had written it that very night, sitting at the old table in the shed, his handwriting carefully copied from notes found in Hannah's notebooks. He spent hours practicing testing letters, observing the details of every curve until it was perfect enough to fool even a desperate mother. When he finished, he tucked the paper into a book and smiled with satisfaction. The plan was simple: close the case, erase all doubt. And it worked. The police closed the case the following week. Thomas continued his life as if nothing had happened. He greeted neighbors, mowed their lawns, fixed their bikes. Sometimes he brought Linda soup, telling her she needed to eat. He pretended to be the friend who wouldn't give up, the neighbor who cared. But at night, when everyone was asleep, he returned to the shed and descended the stairs hidden behind the false wall. There, the sound of the padlock echoed like a sentence. Hannah was still alive, weak, trembling, but alive. For the first few days she tried to scream, to beg, to bang on the walls, but the shed was deep, isolated, and the sound died away before reaching the street. Over time, she learned to conserve her strength, to bide her time. Thomas spoke to her little, but always methodically. Sometimes he left food, other times he just watched motionless for long minutes. "You should be grateful," he said softly. "No one outside looked for you. I'm the only one who still thinks of you." It was as if he believed his own lies, as if he truly saw himself as the savior and not the tormentor. His gaze was empty, distant, but there was a dark spark of pleasure when he saw her fear. Some days he would sit in the corner drinking coffee, while Hannah remained still, trying to pretend to sleep. And when he left, she counted every second, every sound, trying to understand the pattern of his visits. It was the only way she could keep her mind clear, to observe, to plan, to survive. Outside, Linda was beginning to lose track of time. Sometimes she woke up thinking it was Sunday, but it was already Thursday. The wall clock had stopped working, and she never changed the batteries. She lived in a cycle of insomnia and despair, sustained by an almost unhealthy hope. The note remained on the table, crumpled, as if she kept it there only to hate it. Something in her told her it wasn't real. Sometimes she picked up the page and ran her fingers over the words, feeling the paper, trying to absorb what it concealed. It was in one of these moments that she noticed a tiny flaw, a mistake Hannah would never make. At the bottom of the note, the letter A in her own name was written differently, more rigidly, as if forced. It was the missing detail for the doubt to return with full force. That discovery rekindled something in her that had been crushed. Fury. Linda got up, grabbed the note, and went to Thomas's house. He opened the door with that practiced smile and calm gaze. "Linda, is everything okay?" She held the paper up in front of him, her voice shaky but firm. "Where did you find this? Did you put it in my mailbox?" He looked surprised, then gave a light laugh. "What? No, of course not. I got copies too, you know. I think she wanted everyone to know she's okay." The lie came out easily, almost naturally, but his gaze wavered for a second, and it was in that second that Linda realized. There was no longer any doubt. She left without another word, but her entire body was shaking. She returned home and locked the door. Her breathing was labored, her heart racing. She tried to think rationally, but her head was spinning. She remembered the smell of rust in the shed, the hollow wall, the flickering light at night. Now it all made sense. She took out her notebook and wrote a sentence in large letters. "The note is fake. He's lying." Then he leaned against the wall and cried until his body gave in to exhaustion. Meanwhile, in the shed, Thomas finished organizing his tools, each in its place, as he always did. The sound of the padlock echoed for the last time that night. He glanced at the dark corner where Hannah huddled and said, almost in a whisper, "This will all be over soon. They've given up on you." He calmly closed the door and climbed the stairs. The wind outside blew against the windows, and the moon illuminated the deserted Fairmount Road. And, that early morning, while Linda tried to understand the extent of the deception, the man everyone saw as a kind neighbor walked calmly back home, convinced that once again he had won. But what he didn't know was that very night, Linda would make a decision that would change everything, one that would cause the silence of that town for the first time to begin to shatter. Linda woke before sunrise, her heart racing and her head pounding. All night long she dreamed of the note. She dreamed of Hannah trying to write, crying, asking for help, and someone behind her forcing her to draw the letters. She woke in a cold sweat, as if she'd heard her daughter calling her name. She felt the weight of certainty on her body. The note was fake, and if it was fake, someone had placed it there. Someone who knew too much. Someone who wanted to close the case once and for all. She got out of bed, turned on the lights, and began gathering everything she had. Notes, copies of police reports, dates, photos. She spread it all out on the kitchen table, creating a timeline. In every detail, the same figure repeated itself. Thomas Reed. He was in everything, in every search, every meeting, every conversation. The perfect neighbor, the man who never missed a beat. It was impossible to ignore. Thomas always showed up when she needed him, knew what to say, knew the times, the places, and the more Linda remembered, the more she realized how much it all fit together. He had been the first to arrive the morning of the disappearance, the first to suggest the warehouse as a base, the first to say that Hannah must have left. It all seemed part of a carefully plotted script, and now, after the note, it made all too much sense. What had once seemed like kindness now felt like surveillance. What had once seemed like care now felt like control. Her head spinning, Linda decided she needed proof. The police wouldn't believe her assumptions, and deep down, she knew no one else cared. So she decided to go it alone. She grabbed her car, a flashlight, and an old digital camera she'd used in high school. Before leaving, she took a deep breath and looked at Hannah's photo on the bookshelf. "I'll find you," she whispered, "if I have to dig hell." She drove through the empty streets of Fairmount, the sky still brightening. She stopped the car a few feet from Thomas's lot and waited. The warehouse was quiet, shrouded in morning mist. The gate, once again, was ajar. Linda got out of the car, her steps light, her heart pounding so loud it seemed to echo inside her head. She walked slowly inside, smelling the strong smell of rust and oil. The floor creaked beneath her feet. She used her flashlight to illuminate the corners. Tools, wooden boxes, scraps of metal. Everything seemed normal. But when she reached the back wall, something caught her eye. A small crack in the paint, barely visible, a detail out of place. She walked closer and ran her fingers over the crack. The sound she heard when she rapped her knuckles was the same as it had been weeks ago, hollow. She bent down and this time saw something she hadn't noticed before, a mark on the floor as if a door had been dragged. The air grew heavier. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. A strong, almost sweet smell rose from the concrete. She bent down closer, pressed her ear to the wall, and for a second she swore she heard a sound, something like faint breathing, a distant moan. Her heart nearly stopped. Before she could check, the sound of footsteps outside made everything freeze. Thomas was coming. She turned off the flashlight, huddled behind a stack of boxes, and tried to control her breathing. The gate opened, and the sound of the lock clanging echoed in the air. He entered, whistling calmly, as if fulfilling a daily ritual. With each step, Linda felt her stomach churn. He passed close to her, so close that she could smell the strong smell of gasoline mixed with sweat. He walked to the back, stopped in front of the wall, and remained silent for a few seconds. Then, something metallic sounded, the click of a lock being unlocked. Linda held her breath. She saw his silhouette bend down, push open a small door set into the wall, and disappear for a few seconds. Her heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to vibrate in her chest. When he returned, he was holding a tray. There was something on it. It looked like a plate of food and a bottle of water. He set it down, looked into the opening, and said something Linda would never forget. "I'll be back later today. Be quiet. Do you hear me?" Her mind exploded. This was real. He was talking to someone. And in that instant, Linda knew without a shadow of a doubt that Hannah was there. She fought not to cry, not to run, not to scream. She knew that if he saw her, everything would be lost. Thomas stayed in the shed for a few more minutes, then locked the door, checked the windows, and left. He waited for the sound of footsteps to fade before standing up. His entire body trembled. His breath felt short. He walked to the wall, ran his hands along the edge of the opening, and noticed a small gap between the boards. He looked through the gap and saw only darkness, but the silence on the other side wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that breathes. Linda backed away slowly, tears streaming, her body trembling. She wanted to open that door, break it down, free her daughter right then and there. But her fear was greater, that he would return, that he would do something worse, that it would all end there. She stumbled out of the warehouse, got into her car, and drove aimlessly for minutes. She cried silently, just her hands clenching the steering wheel and her gaze lost. When she finally parked, she took a deep breath and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. She was pale, her eyes red, but there was something new there. Determination. Now she knew. It was no longer a guess, no longer intuition. Hannah was alive. And Thomas Reed, the man everyone respected, was the monster she'd been searching for since day one. That night, Linda didn't sleep. She sat on the living room floor with her camera in hand, mentally reviewing every step she would take the next day. She needed proof, needed to record what she saw. She planned to return to the warehouse, photograph the wall, record the sound, show the world she was right. And as she wrote everything down in her notebook, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps outside. Slowly, she glanced out the window. Thomas was standing on the sidewalk, staring toward her house, motionless, his hands in his pockets. The wind blew his coat, and even in the dim light, Linda was certain of one thing. He knew she had figured it out, but his look wasn't one of anger. It was a warning, a silent, cold warning that said more than any words could, "Don't get involved where you shouldn't." Linda stepped away from the window, her heart racing, her entire body trembling, and in that moment, she realized there was no turning back. The game had changed. She knew the truth, and now Thomas knew she knew it too. The next morning, Linda went to the police station with the conviction of someone carrying an undeniable truth. She walked in firmly, clutching her notebook, the photos she'd taken of the warehouse wall, and the camera with the hastily recorded videos. The officer at the desk, the same one who'd helped her before, looked up with a weary sigh. "Ms. Miller?" Again? She didn't answer, just placed the notebook on the counter. "My daughter is alive. I found her. I heard her voice. She's locked in Thomas Reed's warehouse." The man laughed in disbelief and called the police chief. Minutes later, she stood before him, recounting everything, the fake note, the sound of locks, the muffled sound, the tray of food. The police chief listened silently, but his look betrayed impatience. When she finished, he crossed his arms and sighed. "Ms. Miller, Mr. Reed is an exemplary citizen. He's helped with several search cases. What you're saying is very serious." Linda leaned over the table, her eyes watering, her voice firm. "What he's doing now is even more serious." The police chief stood up, paced back and forth, and finally said he would check, as soon as possible. But his tone was the same as always, empty, formal. She realized they wouldn't do anything, and she knew for sure when, at the end of the conversation, he asked her to try to rest. Anger replaced fear. Linda left trembling, but determined. If no one would do anything, she would, and she wouldn't be alone. That same afternoon, she went to the house of an old friend, Carla Jensen, a retired firefighter who had worked in rescue for years. Carla had known Linda since childhood, and always believed her, even when everyone called her crazy. When Linda told her what she had discovered, Carla was silent for a few seconds. Then she looked her straight in the eye and said, "Then we'll go there. But we have to be careful. If this man is who you say he is, he'll react." For the first time in a long time, Linda felt she wasn't alone. The two began planning what they would do. Carla grabbed flashlights, radios, gloves, and said she would call an old acquaintance from the rescue force, Mike Torres, now working as a maintenance technician, but who owed her a favor. The plan was simple and straightforward. Break into the warehouse at night, record everything, and only call the authorities once they had irrefutable evidence. They couldn't risk alerting Thomas too soon. As they organized their plan, Linda couldn't stop glancing out the window. With every passing headlight, she thought it was him. The fear was still there, pulsing deep in her chest, but now it was mixed with something new, courage. And as night fell, as the sky turned a deep blue and the house lights began to dim, they quietly left. Carla drove, and Linda clutched her notebook to her chest. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was purposeful. The warehouse was plunged into darkness. The windows were boarded up, the gate closed, the air still. Carla studied the padlock. Old. "You can open it with this." She pulled a tool from her pocket, and within seconds, the padlock gave way with a snap. The two exchanged. A quick glance, took a deep breath, and pushed open the door. A strong smell filled the air. Mildew, rust, and something else. Something Linda recognized immediately. Fear. They entered slowly, flashlights pointed at the floor. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the concrete, amplifying the silence. In the background, the panel, the false wall. Carla walked over and ran her hand over it. "Are you sure?" Linda nodded. "Behind it. She's there." With a quick swipe, Carla pulled out an iron bar and hit the side of the wall. The sound was dull and a sliver of wood came loose. She hit it again, harder. The structure gave way, revealing a small metal door locked with 2 chains. Linda felt her legs weaken. "It's here," she whispered. Carla began breaking the chains with the pliers. It took a few minutes, but each snap felt like an explosion in Linda's chest. When the second chain fell, she pushed the door open hard. A warm, humid wind rushed out, along with the faint sound of breathing. The flashlights illuminated the space, and for a second the whole world seemed to stop. There, in the corner of the room, huddled, dirty, with sunken eyes and disheveled hair, was Hannah, alive. Linda screamed her daughter's name and ran to her. Hannah tried to get up, but her body barely responded. She cried, sobbed, and hugged her mother with a strength that seemed to come from another world. Carla, with tears in her eyes, used the radio to call for help. "We found the girl. She's alive." Her voice trembled. Outside, the sound of sirens began to echo through the sleeping city, but the joy was short-lived. As they left the warehouse, still holding each other, Linda heard the sound of the gate slamming open. Thomas was there. His usual calm face was gone. His look was one of pure fury. "What have you done?" he shouted, his voice distorted with hatred. Carla stepped forward, gripping the iron bar. "Stay where you are, Thomas." He took a step forward, but stopped when he heard the sound. Of sirens approaching. For a moment he seemed to weigh his options. Then he stepped back, his eyes fixed on Linda and Hannah. "You destroyed everything," he murmured. "They'll never understand what happened here." The police arrived within minutes, storming the property with guns drawn. Thomas tried to escape through the back door but was apprehended just around the corner. Linda watched in disbelief, her daughter alive, the kidnapper arrested, and the entire town awakened by the sound of patrol cars. Hannah trembled in her arms, repeating between sobs, "I knew you were coming. I knew." As the officers led Thomas away in handcuffs, Linda took one last look at him. The man who for months had been the symbol of kindness was now showing himself for what he truly was, a predator masquerading as a neighbor. And behind the flashing lights and the wailing sirens, a certainty grew within her. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of another struggle, the struggle to rebuild what fear had destroyed. And as the paramedics loaded Hannah into the ambulance, Carla held Linda's hand and said softly, "I told you he'd fight back, but we fought back first." Linda nodded, her eyes welling, and took one last look at the warehouse. The open door swayed in the wind, creaking as if it held echoes of everything that had happened inside. And deep in her heart, she knew there were still unanswered questions, questions that, in time, might show this nightmare wasn't over. The sound of sirens cut through the dawn like an open wound, illuminating the narrow streets of Fairmount with flashes of red and blue. The news spread too quickly. Even before the sun rose, the entire town knew that Hannah Miller had been found alive. The neighborhood, until then lulled to sleep by the silence of indifference, now awoke in shock. Police cars, ambulances, onlookers, everyone crowded around the warehouse that, for months, had stood there, discreet, invisible, hiding the most terrible secret of all. Linda knelt beside her daughter, holding her trembling hands, trying to convince her it was real, that this nightmare was finally over. Hannah, still dazed, looked around as if trying to understand where she was, what had happened, who had saved her. Her eyes were sunken, her face pale, her skin marred with bruises, but alive, breathing, and that was enough. As the paramedics placed her on the stretcher, Hannah began to cry, unable to say a word. The tears flowed silently, as if her body were speaking for her. Linda walked beside her, never letting go of her hand, repeating over and over, "I'm here, love, I'm here." Each step to the ambulance felt like a miracle. Around her, neighbors watched in silence, some with their hands over their mouths, unable to believe it. Thomas Reed, the man everyone respected, was now inside the police car, handcuffed, his gaze fixed on the ground. No words, no protest, just the same calm expression he used to deceive everyone. But there was something different this time, a blankness in his eyes, a cold, restrained anger, as if he still believed he had some power over the situation. As he was taken away, Linda watched him through the ambulance window. For a moment, their eyes met. And in that second, time seemed to stand still. There was an unspoken promise there, that evil may lose, but it never completely disappears. Thomas looked away, and Linda felt her entire body tremble. It was as if she had finally looked into the eyes of hell and survived. At the hospital, Tension turned into a mixture of relief and pain. Hannah was taken straight to emergency care. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, assessing injuries, checking vital signs, administering IV fluids. Linda stood outside, hugging her arms, her body exhausted, her eyes red. Every second of waiting felt like an eternity. When they finally let her in, the scene broke her heart. Hannah, lying there, her hair tangled, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, her body trembling as if she were still there, trapped, scared, small. Linda approached slowly, sat on the edge of the bed, and held her hand. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of everything that had been lost, and everything that still remained. The love, the pain, the survival. Hours later, the hospital was swarming with press, reporters, cameras, microphones. How was she found? Who is Thomas Reed? Is she going to testify? Questions came from all sides, but Linda didn't say a word. The police chief, the same one who had disbelieved her so many times, now tried to justify himself in front of the cameras. He talked about joint efforts, teamwork, a happy outcome. But Linda knew the truth. If it were up to them, Hannah would be dead. It was a mother's love that brought her back, not the efficiency of the system. At the end of the day, when the crowds had died down and the hospital corridor had fallen silent, Linda stepped out into the courtyard. The sun was setting behind the trees, tinting the sky orange and gold, and for the first time in months she felt air rush into her lungs without pain. She was exhausted, her body aching, her mind filled with images she would never forget. But there was also a new sensation. Light, almost imperceptible. Peace. Hannah was sleeping safely, and Thomas was trapped. That was enough for now. But as she scanned the horizon, a nurse approached with her cell phone in hand. "Ms. Miller, sorry to interrupt, but you might want to see this." It was a news story. Thomas's face was plastered across the screen, accompanied by the headline, "Man accused of kidnapping may be involved in other cases." The report mentioned neighboring towns, the names of other missing girls, dates that coincided with periods he had lived abroad. Linda's blood ran cold. Every change of address, every city he had visited, all marked by similar stories, girls who had vanished without a trace. She stood there, her cell phone trembling, in her hands as the nurse walked away. The cold night wind blew against her face, bringing with it a distant memory, the sound of chains on the floor, the smell of rust, the fake note. Everything came flooding back, as if the past still tried to scream. Thomas was trapped, yes, but the evil he represented was perhaps greater than she imagined. When she returned to the room, Hannah was fast asleep, breathing heavily but peacefully. Linda sat beside the bed and ran her hand through her daughter's hair, studying every feature of her face, as if trying to memorize that it was real. Outside, the city lights flickered in the distance, and the sound of sirens had finally ceased. For a moment, she believed the worst was over, but deep down, she knew that trauma doesn't disappear with the dawn. There were scars that time doesn't heal, and questions that might never be answered. As the clock struck 2 in the morning, Linda got up, went to the window, and looked out. The city was quiet, but something in the air seemed uneasy. The warehouse had been cordoned off, surrounded by yellow tape, but even from there she swore she could hear the sound of wind whipping against the metal walls, a low, uneven sound, reminiscent of chains. She closed the curtain slowly and walked back to Hannah, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The worst was over, or so they said, but inside her, a quiet voice still insisted, some secrets don't stay buried for long. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions that Linda could never explain in words. After the rescue, the town seemed to be in a state of collective shock. Fairmount, which had always been synonymous with tranquility and routine, now bore the weight of a nightmare revealed in broad daylight. The streets were filled with cameras, journalists, and curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to see the home of the model neighbor who had deceived everyone for months. Thomas Reed made headlines, and the Miller family's name spread across the news as a symbol of survival. But behind the headlines, away from the lights and interviews, there was something much quieter, the painful return to real life. In the hospital, Hannah faced the first days of recovery. Her body weakened, her mind fragmented, fear still raw in every look. She slept little, woke up startled, cried without knowing why. Sometimes she simply fell silent, staring at the ceiling as if she were still in that warehouse. Linda stayed by her daughter's side the entire time, speaking softly, touching her hand, trying to bring her back to the present. "You're safe now," she repeated. "He won't hurt you anymore." But the words, though true, seemed small compared to the trauma. The wound was deeper than any prison could heal. When they were finally discharged, the two returned home. The door that once opened onto their home now felt like the boundary between the past and a new beginning. Everything was the same, but nothing was the same anymore. The curtains, the sofa, Hannah's room, every corner of the house brought back memories. Linda tried to restore her routine, make coffee, listen to music, but the silence weighed heavily. At night, her daughter avoided sleeping alone. The lights were left on, and the sound of any gate opening still made her shudder. But little by little they began to rebuild. Small gestures, like eating together or walking to the garden, became victories. It was a timid but real new beginning. Meanwhile, Thomas awaited trial. The courtroom, sitting before the jury, he maintained the same cool, controlled expression. Not a hint of regret, not a tear. When prosecutors showed photos of the shed, the chains, the fake note, he watched silently, as if witnessing a story that didn't belong to him. Hannah appeared only once to testify. The courtroom atmosphere left her pale, the air thin, her heart racing. But when she took the witness stand, she looked directly at the man who destroyed her and said, her voice trembling but firm, "You will never make me afraid again." That was enough. Thomas looked away for the first time. The sentence came months later. Life imprisonment. The judge said the case would serve as a warning, a reminder that evil can live next door, wear the same smile, say the right words. When the verdict was read, Linda wept, not with joy, but with relief. It wasn't justice she felt, it was closure, a necessary end so that fear would at least cease to have a shape. In the following months, life resumed its rhythm. Hannah began therapy and slowly resumed her studies, trying to reconnect with the world. Linda, for her part, learned to deal with silence in a new way, no longer as an enemy, but as a space to breathe. The trauma still lived with them, but it no longer dominated them. The two began walking every afternoon down the same street where it all began, and although the fear was still there was also a strength that had not existed before. In 2021, 8 years later, a documentary crew knocked on Linda's door asking for an interview. They wanted to tell the story from her perspective, to give a voice to the woman no one believed. She agreed, but made one request: no dramatization, no fancy script. She wanted them to show exactly how it happened. During the recording, she sat in front of the cameras and told everything, from beginning to end. She talked about the night of her disappearance, the weeks of police neglect, the fake note, and most importantly, the moment she found Hannah alive. Her voice faltered at times, but she continued. At the end, the reporter asked, "What would you say to someone going through something similar?" Linda thought for a moment, looked at the ground, and replied with the same calm she now carried in her eyes. "Evil can live next door, and sometimes it even helps you find what you've hidden." The interview aired and went viral. Thousands of people commented that they cried, that they felt her pain, that they started paying more attention to their own neighbors. But for Linda, that didn't matter so much anymore. She wasn't seeking fame or recognition. All she wanted was for no one else to experience what she and Hannah had. The story became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest situations the truth can be found, if only someone has the courage to keep searching. One autumn afternoon, while sweeping the yard, Linda saw Hannah lying on the grass, drawing. The sun fell gently on her face, and for a moment she seemed the same girl she'd always been, the one who dreamed of studying art and seeing the world. Linda smiled. That simple moment was enough to remind her that they had won, not without pain, not without scars, but they had won. The past still lived there, in the shadows the wind left on the walls, in the sounds that came from the gate at night, in the memories that time would not erase. But now, there was something stronger than fear, the certainty that, even after everything, life could still begin again. And it was in this silent new beginning that the Miller's story ended, not with noise, not with applause, but with the simple sound of two peaceful breaths. Mother and daughter, side by side, survivors of a horror that tried to destroy them, but which in the end only revealed what had always existed between them, a love that not even evil could erase. Stories like Hannah and Linda's touch us in a unique way because they show that evil can lurk where you least expect it, and that courage, even in the darkest hours, can change everything. This video made you feel, think, and imagine every detail, and if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you also connected with this truth, that the search for justice and truth never ends. And that's why now what you do helps keep these kinds of stories alive. Each like allows more people to learn about cases that deserve to be remembered, and each new subscription keeps this space of empathy, mystery, and resilience growing. Write your words in the comments below. Strength, to show that you believe no truth stays hidden forever. And get ready, because the next story will captivate you even more. A new disappearance, new clues, and a revelation no one will be expecting. So take a deep breath, like, subscribe now, and stay with us. The next case is about to begin.